Okay, thanks for joining everybody. This is Jason Warman with Pack Genesis. We'll go ahead and get started with today's training session. So today we're going to be specifically taking a look at Aspera Faspex. Aspera Faspex is one of the two main web applications that have long been available for customer deployed installations. Faspex is a user-to-user type of interface, very widely deployed for both distribution use cases. In other words, sending a set of files to one or more recipients, but also for submission or ingest use cases. An easy web application interface that lets folks send content in, through a simple web browser. We'll be taking a look at a few different things from sort of both sides of the equation here. We'll take a look at the architecture, overall architecture, and actually run through a basic installation of Aspera Faspex. We'll then hop into the web interface and look at things from both an end user point of view, sending and receiving packages, as well as more of an administrative or operational role. What some of the different configuration options are, looking at user accounts and groups and managing those, and then some of the additional features like work groups and drop boxes. As we walk through this, just a quick definition, because I'll probably throw this out there. Faspex is often referred to as a package sending mechanism. In other words, a digital package mechanism. And really that package is just a copy of one or more files that are made available to one or more recipients. It's a little bit different than, say, Aspera Shares, which we'll cover in a future session. That's more of a live storage view. Faspex is more like, okay, here's a copy of these 10 files as they exist in a particular point in time, and I'm sending them to you to make them available. All of the underpinning technology, of course, is using the Aspera FAST protocol that we've discussed over a past session. So, everything as far as performance, reliability, redundancy, encryption, that all stays true even when coming through the Faspex web interface. And as always, we are going to reserve a bit of time at the end of the session for Q&A. So if you have any questions as we're walking through this, please jot those down, and then we'll come back at the end and open it up for those. Okay, let me shrink this over here, and I'll just sort of keep this in the background so we can refer to it as needed. I'm going to start with maybe just a quick diagram around Aspera Faspex to kind of give you a better sense of what these components are that we're going to be working with today. So the first is the high-speed transfer server, which we covered in an earlier session. This is that core piece of Aspera server-side technology. The high-speed transfer server package is installed on a Windows or a Linux system. This is the one that's doing the heavy lifting as far as actually acting as an endpoint for the Aspera protocol. This is also the piece that's interacting with some sort of storage on the back end, right? So this could be SAN or NAS storage, or even local disk that's available on this machine. This could also be object storage in the case of the cloud, right? So this could be an S3 bucket or an Azure blob area that this machine has access to. Now, layered on top of this transfer server, that's when we get into Aspera Faspex. So Faspex is a separate component. It's an application on its own. In particular, it's a web app that basically gives a user interface for end users to interact with, layered on top of high-speed transfer server here. And in fact, let's kind of sketch out what this really looks like, or what this means from an end user perspective, or from a network perspective even. So as an end user makes connections into this type of environment, there's really two things that are happening. So the first thing is that we're coming into the Faspex web interface. This is just over your standard, HTTPS 443. This is completely within the web browser. So this is where you access the Faspex website, log in with your credentials, browse through the options, set up a transfer. All of these things are just done over typical HTTPS. When it comes time to do the actual file transfer, then a second connection is made directly from the end user to the high-speed transfer server. And this is the Aspera FASP protocol, right? So this is FASP, which, if you'll recall, runs over TCP and UDP 33001. So, the important here, because these are two different components, they can live on two different servers. In fact, that's a pretty common type of deployment scheme. And in today's case that we'll be running through, we will be working with two different servers here, two Linux servers, one running the high-speed transfer server, one running Faspex. And by the way, this connection in between these two guys, from Faspex to the high-speed transfer server, you may recall from our previous session, the Node API, that this is that connection, right? And this should actually be 9092, sorry. So to sort of walk through this again, end to end here, I'm actually going to break this out in a couple of different ways here. So on the end user side, we can actually go a little bit further and step into these two components. So there's the web browser, like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and then there's Aspera Connect. Now, Aspera Connect is that client side end user, or the end user side client application that has plugins for the major browsers. So if you can kind of follow this through, let's say my browser, let's say Chrome, connects into Faspex over HTTPS, like we said, and initiates a download. Faspex communicates with the transfer server, because that's where all the storage is. This is the engine that's doing the lifting. Faspex communicates to the transfer server over the Node API. One of the things that it does as part of this download request is it asks for an authorization token from the transfer server. The transfer server generates one that Faspex receives. Faspex gives this to the end user so that their Connect client can make a connection to HSTS and know that it's authorized. All right. So we have sort of a four distinct components here that are operating. The end user's browser that talks to the Faspex server, which talks to the Aspera transfer server, and then Connect, which has a browser plugin, makes that FASP connection to actually do the download and pull the data from the transfer server here. Okay. From but just another general note from a sort of architecture perspective, the transfer server is something that you typically size based on, how much traffic it's going to get. As I mentioned, transfer server is doing all the heavy lifting and interacting with the storage. That does mean that the Faspex server, it is truly just a web app, so it does not involve, as we see here, directly in that file transfer exchange. There is a component here in an included MySQL database that Faspex uses under the covers for its configuration, as well as storing all of the information, sort of the metadata about these digital packages that live on the transfer server. So MySQL is a fairly large component of this, and in a scenario where you have a high volume of transactions coming through or high number of users, that data volume can grow quite a bit. So it's something to take into consideration when thinking about sizing out these Faspex servers. Is not only just the web app, serving the web connections, but also that database on the back end. Okay, so let's hop to it and actually go and start installing this thing. So I've got, again, here another Aspera, or I'm sorry, a cloud server just running, vanilla Linux that we're going to install into. There's actually two different RPM packages that are involved in Aspera Faspex. There's a common package. This has common underlying components, things like that MySQL database, but also Apache and a few other things. And then there's the Faspex RPM itself. So we'll go ahead and run through this. It's a pretty straightforward type of scenario here. So I'll just go ahead and run through the 2 RPMs. This is, by the way, also available for Windows. So there's a single installer that's available for Windows that includes both the common components as well as the underlying Faspex. Okay, so that's gone through. I'll go ahead and start the RPM install for Faspex. Now, once this goes through, we're going to run a little script here, ASCTL Faspex setup. ASCTL is one of the included components here that's sort of an Aspera controller that lets you interact with the various Aspera components that are included with the Faspex. This also works with Aspera console that we'll see down the road, as well as Orchestrator. Later on to today's session, we'll take a closer look at some of the other options in ASCTL. But for right now, we're just going to run ASCTL Faspex setup. Now, I won't go through all of the little detailed settings here. One thing I'll just point out is that there's 2 options, a streamlined option or a detailed setup. Streamlined is good when you have everything running on a single host. In other words, when Faspex and high-speed transfer server are on the same box. In this case, they're on different boxes, so I'm going to go ahead and go on detailed. Again, a lot of these things like what base ports the Mongrel should run on. We're just going to accept the defaults for most of these guys, and keep moving on here. One of the things that we'll be doing as part of this is I do still have access to my HSTS server that we installed on our last session. So that's the one we're going to be using for the underlying transfer engine here. Okay, so I don't want to run this locally. What address or host name should the web server use to communicate with the transfer server, right? In other words, what's that machine name that we want to do? So I actually have this in DNS, hststraining.pacgenesis.com. What address or host name should end users use to communicate with the transfer server? So you'll notice that this is sort of a little bit of a variation on the same question. Moving back to this diagram, this is all about what do we need to use for Faspex to talk to this guy, and what do we need to use for the end user to talk to this guy. In this case, it's the same thing, but in a lot of scenarios, if this is like an internal, 10 dot address that is all in your own DMZ or something, you may need Faspex to use that 10 dot instead of the publicly routable address coming through the internet here. So that's the reason for the 2 different names. So we're going to have a login name for the first admin user. Now this is referring to the admin user for the web interface. So I'm just going to call it Faspex admin. By the way, you can have as many administrators as you like. This is just the initial user account. I'll give this my address and a password. One note on this. This is setting the initial password for the admin user. The very first time you log in, you're going to have to change it. So if you have a long, complicated one you were banking on using initially, just wait, give it a simple one here. Okay, again, for some of these options, we're just going to take the defaults. As I mentioned, there is a MySQL component here, so it's asking for a root password. For my SSL certificate, right? So this is a web application, so it's going to generate a self-signed cert first. We'll replace that with a real cert down the line here. Okay, so this is going to start running the rest of the setup routine, including creating the database and seeding everything. So this will take just a couple of minutes here. Now, as this is running, one thing we can do is go start getting our high-speed transfer server prepped and ready to go. Now, in that previous scenario where everything's running on one server, this script will take care of everything for you. But in this case, well, we have a separate HSTS, so we're gonna set everything up manually. Okay. The first thing we'll do here is actually one thing that we didn't do the first time we installed HSTS is to make sure that SSH is listening on that high port. You know, we typically don't recommend exposing port 22 on the internet. You know, there's just so many scripts that'll hammer your server. So the default recommended port and what a lot of end users for Aspera expect is port 33001 on SSH. So I'm just editing my SSHD config, and I'm going to restart SSHD. And hopefully we should be listening there now. Okay. We need to create a user account. So sort of hopping back here, you know, the end user is going to authenticate with the Faspex application. In other words, for end users, we're moving authentication up to this Faspex layer. But there does still need to be a service account that's used for this connection from the Connect client into the high-speed transfer server. So it's one single OS level user, and then as I said, the end user authentication is moved up to the web app layer. So I'm going to add a user called Faspex. One note here, if I haven't mentioned it before, ASP shell. This is a false shell that ships with high-speed transfer server. If you set a user shell to ASP shell, it means that they can execute the Aspera commands, but they can't log in interactively. Right? This is truly an OS level user. So if we set this to the default or left it at bash or whatever, if somebody happened to have the credentials, they'd be able to SSH into the box as this user. Okay, so I'm going to decide where to put these Faspex packages. I'm just going to create a directory here. This will probably often be like a mount, NFS mount or something like that. But we just need to make sure that we have something identified and that this Faspex user has the file system permissions to it. If everybody remembers the settings for HSTS, they're all in this opt Aspera etsy-aspera.com file. So we're going to use the AS configurator command to set up this new user in the way that we need. Right. So first we're setting the absolute path, the doc root to this Faspex packages that I've created. We want to require, that's actually the wrong one, that should be token. We're going to require a token for this user, the Faspex user, to be authorized to transfer. What that means is that outside of just the initial SSH connection, because this user is being used for one of the web apps, Faspex, we need one of these Node API authorization tokens to be included in this initial handshake. Otherwise, HSTS will reject this, the connection, right? So this verifies and validates that this connection coming into HSTS is something that was brokered here by Faspex. So these two AS configurators for authorization transfer in and for transfer out mean that we're requiring a token. Okay. We also need a token encryption key. So token encryption key, this is for the dynamic, session-based encryption on the fly, basically protecting the data in transit. The encryption key, it's not like this is the actual key that's being used. There's a public key exchange at the beginning of each session. This is more like a salt that's used for, generating those dynamic keys. Okay, and the other thing we need to do, because this is going to be coming in through the web interface, is to set up an SSH key pair for that initial connection. Hopping back to this diagram, Connect, the Connect browser plugin client has an SSH key included with it. it's going to use that to make this initial SSH connection into the HSTS. That's not going to be enough to actually transfer though, because we set this transfer in and transfer out value to token. So it needs this well-known SSH key as well as a valid authorization token, which is why all of these settings are so important to use in conjunction with each other. But let me go ahead and create home faspex.ssh. The pub side of this SSH key is Aspera token auth rsa.pub, and I'm going to put that into the authorized keys files in their home directory. And then let's just fix up the ownership since I'm root right now. Faspex.ssh and the mode. Home faspex.ssh. As you guys, I'm sure, are aware, SSH is pretty picky about the ownership and permissions here. Okay, one last thing we need to do in preparation to connect these two guys up. Again, we're using the Node API to connect from the Faspex web app to the transfer server. Node API is a REST API, so we need to create some credentials for it. As you may remember from our previous session, there's a cool a tool called AS Node Admin that's used. If I do a -L, we can see the node user that we worked with on our previous session. We're going to create a new one that Faspex is going to use. So I'll say the user is Faspex node. We give it a password here, Lime 5590. And we're going to tie it to this Faspex OS account, right? So these are the two the credentials for the Node API itself, Faspex node and this Lime, and then -X is saying anytime you come in with this set of Node API credentials, it's in context of the Faspex OS user. Okay, I'm going to restart Aspera node D, and then we can continue running here. Okay, checking back in on my Faspex install, just a couple of restarts that need to happen here, and then we'll be ready to go. Let's do it. Okay, so this is just about done restarting. So we've got my HSTS server ready to go. It's got all of the prerequisites done. I've got my Aspera Faspex server just doing the final service starts here after doing the install script. Now it's about time to log into the web interface and actually do the rest of the config. One of the other things that's that will be part of this is this is a web app, as we mentioned, so we're running on that self-generated SSL certificate. I actually have another SSL cert, a valid one, signed one, ready to go. So let's go ahead and get that going. I mentioned this ASCTL command before. So this has a couple of a lot of different uses, but one of them is that you can affect the built-in Apache web server. In particular, if I do Apache :help, you can see there's an option here to install SSL cert. So let's do that. Apache install SSL cert, and there are 3 things that we give it. We give it first the cert file, then we give it the key file that corresponds, and then if you have a chain certificate that was given to you by the signer, you specify that. Okay, so it's copied into the appropriate places, my keys, it's restarted Apache. So now if I bring up my web browser and go to Aspera web app, datasneak.net, we should get to the login page. You'll notice here that I have my proper SSL certificate ready to go. And I'm ready to log in, Faspex admin. and my simple password. Never save. Okay, now we need to give this something a little bit more secure. I mentioned this earlier, even though you specify a password in the install script, it's going to make you change it right away. So now that we've got that, Faspex admin, we'll log in. Okay, we've got to install a license here. So let me grab a license file, just copy and paste. I've got a license is valid now. You'll notice I still have a warning, transfer server error is detected. So this is because we haven't set up that connection yet in between the Faspex app and the HSTS server. So let me swing over to File Storage tab. Now we told it where to look. It's this HSTS training. You'll see it has an error. We need to edit this guy and tell it how to connect. Right? In fact, in particular, this username and password. This is the AS Node admin, the Node API set of credentials that we specified with this command. Okay, so I updated the credentials, connection succeeded. While we're here, let me expand this advanced configuration. You'll notice I have this additional configuration option, primary transfer address. So again, this is the difference in this host name or IP address is what the Faspex web server will use to talk to the HSTS. This is what the end users will use to talk to HSTS. So this is always going to be, typically the public address. This may be internal, just depending on your network layout. You'll notice we have this option here for enabling a secondary address. So this is useful in a split kind of scenario, or scenario where internal versus external users will take a different route to this server. And maybe split DNSs and setup or something like that. So I can say for my internal users that are in the same office, they need to go to hsts.internal, .mycompany.com. And you can specify this, like say, if my end user is coming from 10.star, right, or 192.168. whatever. Okay, so that is the basics. Hopefully, let me refresh this here. Let's take a look at what this error is. Oh, you know what? I think I did not click save after testing it. Test is good. Update node. Okay, now it's looking better. This is saying that it's updating. And in just a second here, this should look better. Now it says active. So by the way, this if I click on that active, you'll see a little bit more detail here. There's a mechanism, it's called the node polar service in Aspera Faspex that specifically looks, to make sure that your file transfer for node is up and running and everything looks good on it. So you can get a little bit more detail on that. Okay, so before we start getting into the rest of this, let's actually just do a quick test to make sure that everything is looking okay. So I'm going to send myself a package. For those of you that haven't seen it before, this is the new package screen. So this is basically how to send files to another user. I've got my address, in other words, who's going to be the recipient. You can CC other users on either the upload and or the download or just a receipt for this package. The difference here for the CC, these users don't get access to the content. They just get the notification that the upload or the download has occurred, right? So this is something where if you have somebody on the operational side or the technical side that are sending files back and forth, but they want to CC like a project manager or something. That PM doesn't actually need the content, but they want to be aware when these uploads and downloads happen. That's what the CC field is good for here. Okay, so for title, I'll say Tuesday test file. The little note is optional. Let me go ahead and click Browse for Files. By the way, this little pop-up window, this Connect security warning, the very first time an end user interacts with your Faspex app or even one of the other Aspera apps, they need to make this choice on whether this is okay or not. So I'm going to tell it, remember my choice, and it's okay. I'll just grab a single file and click Send Package. And this is going to initiate from my computer to the high-speed transfer server, this upload. And again, this to kind of fit in all of the components here, this is Aspera Connect. This is that browser plugin client that's installed on my local machine talking to the HSTS. In the background, we saw the Faspex server in my web interface. So we have sort of all four components here. My browser talking to Faspex talking to HSTS on the back end, and then my Connect client talking directly to HSTS. Okay, so we're looking pretty good. We have a Faspex server up. It's talking to the the high-speed transfer server. Let's start walking through a little bit more of the application here. So we saw the new package screen, and again, for folks that haven't seen this before, just a bit of orientation across the main menu bar up top. New package screen is how to send files to another person. If I looked in my received folder, these are packages that somebody has sent me. Now, this last one I sent to myself, so I'm seeing it here in received packages. I will also see it here in my sent items. And by the way, if I kind of look through either of these, let me click on this Tuesday test package here. You can see the details for this test package, some of the stats on the right-hand side here. I included only just a single file in this particular one, but one thing to note, this is actually pretty useful for a lot of workflows. You have the option of downloading the entire package, with this link, or picking and choosing individual files if there are multiple. So this is pretty useful for these very large sets of content where, I've got a bunch of different files and folders that are part of a package, and I want to be able to pick and choose from them. Okay, so again, just for the main overview, my sent items, I can see what I've sent to other users here. My pending items, I think I kind of skipped over this on the new package screen. One of the options that you can allow users to do is, the default is when I send a new package, the release policy is released now. In other words, as soon as I finish uploading it, my recipients are going to get that email notification saying, hey, Jason sent you this, click here to download it. This release policy will let you set a later date. So I can upload this now, but I don't want to release it until midnight on Friday, right? So if I set this release date, those packages will show up here in my pending folder. Right. And again, this is useful, particularly with work from home, where maybe upload speeds aren't great on somebody's, cable or whatever connection they have at home. You may want to sort of stage these on the Aspera Faspex server. Upload packages way ahead of time, just to make sure everything is ready to go, and then release them at a later date. Okay, so kind of continuing the walkthrough here, work groups, let's table this a little bit for now because we're going to come back to it in greater detail. There's a couple of different options around work groups, and essentially this is about, instead of sending to a particular user, you can have some collaboration across multiple users. The accounts screen, we can see just my single user account here. This is where you can add new users. We'll talk a little bit about the specific authentication options in just a minute. And then here in the server area, this is my server configuration. And again, I'm actually logged in as an administrator, so I'm seeing everything here. Regular users, of course, they wouldn't see the server config, and they wouldn't even see the accounts page, right? Those are reserved for privileged users. I do want to walk through some of the main configuration options here in the Faspex server section. You know, the Faspex admin guide is really good about going through all of these in detail. So I'm not going to sort of duplicate everything there, but a few things I do want to particularly highlight. Let's look at the transfer options. So there's a number of different options here. One of the first ones that you're going to want to change is the default transfer rates and the max allowed rates. In other words, how fast can we go? So you may remember from our discussion on high-speed transfer server, you know, you can set limits at the server level. You can also set limits here at the Faspex level, right? So this starts out pretty modestly, you know, 10 megabits. I'm just going to bump this up to, let's say, 100 megabits as the initial rate. And then the default max rate is 20 megabits. Let me bump that up to 200. Okay. Scrolling down here, Aspera Connect settings. So you can set a minimum Connect version. So Connect, again, is the end user browser plugin that's installed, the Connect client. You can see it up here in the upper right-hand corner in my system tray. So I have this installed on my Mac, of course. This is set to 3.9 for this latest version of IBM Faspex. You know, the reason to bump this up is, you know, if there's a particular feature or if there's a, you know, let's say a security vulnerability or something like that, where you want to ensure that all of your users are upgrading, you can bump up this Connect version accordingly. One other thing to mention here, this locally host Connect. So by default, Aspera Connect is served from a public CDN. So this is something that IBM hosts, you know, on public CDNs for all users worldwide. In some scenarios, in particular, highly secure scenarios where end users may not have public internet access, you can host the Connect installers on your local machine here. Right, so that when somebody visits the Aspera Faspex website and doesn't have Aspera Connect already installed, they can pull it down from the same web server that Faspex is running on. Okay, so let's keep walking down here. Distribution lists are pretty straightforward. You can have global distribution lists, basically just, you know, lists of email addresses. Individual users can have their own personal distros as well. Here in the security options, a lot of these are pretty straightforward as far as things like, you know, session timeouts or how many failed password attempts will get you locked out for X number of minutes. Removing users after inactivity. So often a security thing here. Password expiration. You know, a lot of this is sort of self-explanatory. If I keep scrolling down, one option to touch on, self-registration. So by default, this is turned off, right? In other words, for users to be able to access Aspera Faspex, you would generally have to create an administrator would create a user account for them. Or it can come in through you know, through your own SAML single sign-on if that's configured, and we'll get into that in a sec. Self-registration as an option would allow a user to request an account and sort of self-provision. And there's two different modes here: moderated and unmoderated. So as you'd expect, if moderated self-registration is turned on, you know, you can specify your TOS that you want to have the user accept. But then this would notify, particular users that somebody has requested an account on their own, and then an administrator has to come in and either approve or deny each of them. Now, the other option is unmoderated, where somebody can just, accept the terms of service, click on the verify your email option that they get, and then they're ready to go. Don't see unmoderated too much, right? It is there as an option, but typically self-registration is either moderated or turned off completely. Okay, the other option I want to touch on here is how to handle outside email addresses. And this goes for both the sending and receiving side. So if outside email addresses in this section here are turned off, it means that every sender and every recipient needs to have an account on the Faspex system. If I allow inviting external senders, or if I allow sending to external email addresses, this essentially enables you to have ad hoc senders and ad hoc recipients. This is very useful in a lot of workflows. This is a very common configuration option to have. So if I'm, let's say I'm an internal user and I'm working on a project, if it's something where I'm going to be working, let's say, with a freelancer for the next, 90 days on a project, maybe it makes sense. We're going to be working together for 3 months. You'll probably work with other folks in my organization. Let's create a user account for you and give you some permissions. But if I'm doing like a one-off, I'm going to be, sending a package to this person once or twice. Maybe it just doesn't make sense to go through the entire process of creating a user account. So if I have allow sending to external email addresses turned on, I can type in somebody's email address. Even if they don't have an account on the system, they'll be allowed to be a one-time recipient. In other words, they'll get that email that says, hey, Jason sent you this, click here to download it, but they won't have a username and password. They can't do anything else on the system. They're really just a one-time recipient. The inverse is true for inviting external senders, right? Again, if somebody's going to be sending you files for a while, maybe it makes sense to create an account for them. But if somebody just needs to send you a big file once, if you enable this option, you can send them a link that's good to only do one thing, just send you in particular a package. There's nothing else they can do in the system because they don't have an account. By the way, you can see some of the other configuration options sort of related to that, right? So invitation links for sending, you can set expiration policies, after X number of days or after a single upload, the link will expire. Same thing for allowing sending to external email addresses, right? So you can make those links expire after X number of days as well. Or if this one is checked, it would only be downloadable a single time, and then that link to download's no good anymore. Okay, still scrolling down here, encryption we did want to touch on. This is turned on by default, right? Encryption over the wire using AES at one of these bit rates. Encryption at rest is turned off by default. You can turn it on, you can enforce it, or you can make it optional. This style of encryption at rest in particular, this is passphrase-based encryption. In other words, if you turn this on, then a sender is required to type in a passphrase when they upload a file. Anybody that downloads the file, they need to get that passphrase. You need to get it to them out of band for them to be able to decrypt the file during or after their download. Right, so it is, it can be a powerful feature, but just keep in mind that it is passphrase based, so you do still need some sort of communication channel where you can provide those passphrases to the recipients after the fact. Okay, we do have some options here around out of transfer file validation. So this is running some sort of validation on the content as part of the upload or sort of tangential to the upload. File name obfuscation is an option to make sure that if somebody has access to the raw files, they won't be able to tell what they are. You'll notice here it is not reversible. And then this is actually something that's fairly recent in Aspera Faspex, and that's the option to set quotas on senders. So you can, if this is enabled, have a rolling window of quota at a particular limit, right? And by the way, there are specific bypass lists here for both recipients and senders, where you can, based on domain name for either of those, make sure things don't count towards the quota. Okay. The next thing I want to sort of touch on here is the notifications area. So as you may imagine, you know, the Faspex workflow is very email oriented, and down the left-hand side here, these are all different. All of the different events that will trigger an email notification to be sent from Aspera Faspex. You know, everything from the welcome email to a package received, you know, dear John, somebody sent you this package, or on the flip side, you know, dear John, the package that you uploaded has been downloaded, right? So these are all individual events that will trigger an email. You can customize each one of these using a template. You can see all of the specific variables that you can plug in that will have the specific details. You can also edit the HTML directly, right? So it has the same variables that you can place in here, but you can, in this case, edit the HTML so that you can customize these to look at a little bit more custom for your organization. Okay. As an administrator, the first thing, of course, that you'll need to do is actually set an mail server, right? So Faspex, this is running in your environment. It needs to know how to set these things over. In fact, actually, let me go ahead and point this maybe to SMTP bucket, just in case we need to take a look at any of these that go out. Just going to say these are going to come from no reply at faspex.com. Okay, so we've got the email notification set up at least to go through SMTP bucket. We've got the different options here, the different actions that will trigger an email notification. Let's actually take a look at authentication, because there are a couple of different ways to authenticate your users. The first option, and the most basic, is to use local accounts that just exist within the Faspex server, right? In other words, this accounts tab up top, if I just create an account there, that's going to be in the Faspex database. Everything is completely local inside of Faspex. You can also point to existing directory services, right? In other words, if you have an AD or even just a straight up LDAP server for user accounts, you can point at those. It does need the all the typical things you would think. What's my server? What port am I connecting on? Typically 389 or 636. What is the tree base? In other words, what's the DN for the tree base here? And then some credentials on how to connect in to AD or LDAP. Now, once this connection is made, you still have to manually add in particular users, right? Say either individual user accounts or groups of users based on group membership in your AD or LDAP infrastructure. Now, increasingly, what a lot of our customers are doing is relying on SAML for single sign-on. So this can be anything like ADFS or Okta or one of the SAML providers out there, but it is pretty straightforward, right? So you can import if your SAML provider, your IDP, gives you a metadata URL, or you can manually specify what those settings are. So these are all just standard, IDP things. What's my SSO target? We need a fingerprint or a certificate down here. And then how do we map out our attributes? In other words, this is what Faspex wants on the left-hand side. What is the assertion going to give us as far as those specific attributes? So this is just something that needs to be coordinated with your SAML IDP. One thing to note, once you do have SAML configured here, any user accounts that are processed via SAML will automatically gain an account here in Faspex. And that's done in a just-in-time type of configuration. In other words, even if I don't have any user account here, if I log into my Okta as Jason at packgenesis.com, as long as Okta says I'm okay for this particular application, the first time I log in, a user account will automatically be created for me here. Now you can also map groups of users. Again, this is either through AD or LDAP via, you'll notice here, a member of attribute, so that group membership in AD or LDAP or passed along via SAML can map to group membership here in Faspex as well. So again, from a kind of large scale deployment standpoint, this does make it a little bit easier to say, okay, I can create a Faspex admin group, that SAML recognizes, map that to an admin group here in Faspex, and I'll automatically gain those credentials and those permissions once I come in. Okay. Now, I mentioned this before. I did want to touch on work groups and drop boxes here inside of Faspex. Let's start with a work group. Now, a work group is essentially a collection of users inside of Aspera Faspex, but based on the permissions that you can assign them, they can be used in a couple of different ways. So the first, I'll say this is project ABC 2020. In my workgroup permissions, you can set up and restrict who's allowed to send to the workgroup and whether workgroup members can see and send to each other. And I'll walk through a couple of different common permutations or combinations of these two. So let's take this kind of scenario. So I've set the sending to the workgroup as private. In other words, only members can send to this workgroup. But workgroup members can see and send to each other, right? So in this kind of scenario, if I have 10 users, let's say, 5 internal, 5 external, all in the same thing, any of them can send to the workgroup itself, and everybody will be able to download those files. But also, let's say 2 of us are working on a small part of this project together, we can see and send to each other directly. Right, so this is more sort of a collaboration space type of settings here. Now, on the other hand, if I do a combination like this, where only the workgroup admin can send to this workgroup, and then the individual members, they don't even see or send, they can't send to each other, they don't even see each other. This is good for like a distribution type of workflow. So let's say project ABC 2020, this is content distribution where I've got, 20 different customers worldwide. I want to be able, as a workgroup admin, to send to this one workgroup. All of my 20 customers will be recipients, but those 20 customers, they don't even know about each other. So this collection of settings here, this combination of settings, makes this almost more like a sort of a BCC distribution list, right? And you can see down below, individual workgroup admins can have particular, these are the particular permissions that you allow those. In fact, let me go ahead and create this thing. Maybe this will help make a little bit more sense here. You'll see down at the bottom, I've created my workgroup, ABC 2020. And I can add any number of users, right? So I'll add my own user, of course. I can also create a new user. So let me create one for my colleague Scott, sys.com. So I'm creating an account for him. And he is now a member of this work group as well. So I can add or change my user to be a work group admin while Scott is a standard user. So again, based on those permissions, how you configure this specific work group, you can affect what these individual members are able to do. In this case, because I've set it as moderated and restricted, only I can send to the work group, and then Scott and anybody else that I add here, they really can only just be receivers. Okay. Of course, you can create as many work groups as you like. And as you dive into them, you'll be able to see the particular packages that are part of that particular work group. Now, to sort of contrast that to a Dropbox, a Dropbox here, I'm going to go to create a new Dropbox. A Dropbox, and again, not to be confused with Dropbox.com, the service. A Dropbox is really just a specialized type of work group that has a couple of interesting features around it. So I'm going to say this one is a video submission portal. In this Dropbox creation here, you can set specific instructions. Please upload your video in H.264 format, 1080p, whatever, right? So you can have specific instructions. You can have a metadata profile, which we'll create in just a moment here, which basically allows you to collect additional user-provided metadata about the package as they're uploading it. In other words, you can get the files themselves, and then you can get the metadata that describes the files in whatever format that you'd like, as far as what type of metadata you're requesting. That metadata will be visible here in Faspex, but with this checkbox option, it'll also be saved as an XML file in the root directory of your package, right? So in other words, I'm going to have my content. I'm going to have an XML describing content. So if I'm doing any sort of automated processing on the other side of this, here it is, and here's the sidecar. Okay. Now we can do options like expiring packages on an individual basis, or expiring the invitation links. These are all customizable per Dropbox. But let me go ahead and create this so we can take a little bit of a closer look. Okay, I've created this video submission portal. Back here in the server tab, there's a metadata area where I can create a new metadata profile. So I'll call this one again, vid submission. And you can specify what kind of options that you're asking for. So let's add a text field. My text field is going to be called submitter name. You can specify any illegal characters here, max length, and whether this is required or optional. So I'll say this one's required. I want another one to say, what state are you from? I'm going to make this one optional. I can have a date chooser. Let's say shoot date, make that one required. And then maybe also an option list. Scroll down here. And let's say this is format. This is from phone, so I'll say, let's make them choose between landscape and portrait. You can have a little preview here, and you can see this is what your metadata profile is going to look like, right? I've got my title, that's required, of course. Submitter name, I made required. A state is optional. A shoot date is going to be this date picker. This one I formatted incorrectly, but these are my options here: landscape and portrait, and then an optional note. Right, so now here in my Dropbox, if I look at this video submission portal, I can choose this metadata profile to associate with a Dropbox. So you can see here, you can create as many Dropboxes as you like. Each Dropbox has its own metadata profile. Right? And so the nice thing here is I can send somebody a link to this Dropbox. I'll send one to my personal email. That's good for, and give them a description if you like. You can have a custom policy for expiring this link, and the link can be good for either a single upload or for X number of days. Right, so this does give you some options around allowing ad hoc submissions for folks coming in here, and giving them the option to send you files without having to to create user accounts or anything like that. Oh, and by the way, I should add some regular users, right? So who's going to be able to actually receive these files when they come in? So now both my user account and Scott will see the files that are submitted through this portal. Okay. I'm going to go back here in security, because there's one option that I skipped earlier when talking about outside email addresses that's particularly useful for these Dropboxes, and that's this option for public submission URLs. I'm going to turn this on and allow Dropboxes to manage this themselves, just to give you an idea here. Back here in my video submission portal, if I look at this, you'll see I have this public URL now. So this is something, even outside of like inviting outside submitters, I could just publish this on a site. I'll open this up in a private window here. And if I come directly to this URL, it's straight to a send to Dropbox, right? So I still have to, go through. Actually, this is on SMTP bucket. So this is basically sort of a self-registration just for this one inbox, right? If I pull up this file here, I'm just pulling up my SMTP bucket. Here's the Dropbox invitation. And if I click the URL, this is what the end user experience is going to be like, right? So they have to validate their email address, pretty simple, and then they'll get a unique URL. And you'll notice here, all they can do is submit a file to this Dropbox, right? They have to fill out the form, they have to attach the files, again, any number of files or folders. And you'll notice at the top of my little Faspex screen, I don't even have like that whole menu bar thing, right? This is literally just a one-time thing. All I can do is submit to this one particular Dropbox. By the way, if you enable that public URL option as I did, this will also allow individual end users to enable it for folks sending them files. Right. Okay, a couple of additional things we wanted to get to here, sort of continuing on with the Faspex interface and how it fits in with workflows. Alternative clients, Cargo and Drive. So Aspera Drive in particular is it's an optional client-side program here that allows you to automate some of this. So I think I have it installed. So Aspera Drive. So I can set up Aspera Drive on my Mac or Windows machine to talk to Aspera Faspex. can say my server.net. It's going to prompt me for my username and password. So I'll do my Faspex admin, my password here. And really, in regards to Faspex, the main automation function that's available, and this is really useful for a lot of folks, is that allows you to automatically download packages to a particular folder on my workstation. In other words, whenever somebody sends me a file or a package through Aspera Faspex, even if it's in the middle of the night, I don't need to be there and click on that link. It'll just check every X number of minutes, every minute, every hour, whatever. And anytime somebody sends me new packages, they're automatically going to get downloaded. Right. So it is a good way to do some basic automation. Again, here you can see it in my system tray. I have Aspera drive running on my local machine here. Aspera Cargo used to have a desktop component that's all rolled into Aspera Drive now. There is an Aspera Cargo service that you can run on a Linux machine. Again, same thing, it's an auto downloader, right? So you can install Cargo on a Linux box and automatically download packages to a local file system. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention here, the Aspera CLI. So Aspera CLI package allows you to do some basic automation. I've got it installed on one of my Linux servers here. The actual binary is called Aspera. So I can say, Aspera help Faspex or Aspera Faspex help. And you can see some of the different options, right? Like download a package or list a package or send a package. Just to give you an idea here, this is a quick, simple little shell script I was using to run out of cron and automatically send packages every X number of minutes to put some stress on a Faspex server, right? So this little script was just creating a bogus source file of random size and these parameters using DD. And then you can see the construction of this or the syntax of this command, right? So Aspera Faspex send, I'm sending a file. -F, this is my source file. -H, this was my address of my Faspex server at the time. I've got my username and I put in my password, and then a title as well as a recipient, receiver@examplestudio.com. This last one, -R, this is going to delete my source file after I've sent it. So again, this is sort of a simple use for Aspera CLI because I just wanted to sort of hammer this server every 15 minutes to make sure everything was working okay in the scenario. But as you can see, this is a simple way to do some basic shell scripting to automate sends and receives. And Aspera CLI, by the way, this is freely available. This is available on the IBM.com site if you search for Aspera CLI. So very simple way to do some of those basic automations without getting too far into the REST APIs and all the other APIs that are available. Okay, we did want to mention a couple of more things. The ASCTL command again. So this is sort of the basic command to interact on the shell for the Aspera Faspex system. So I can do things like all status, gets me a status of everything. If I wanted to restart the server, all of the processes, I can do an all restart. Or, if we used Apache before to change the SSL certificate. All of these, by the way, have a help option. So if I do ASCTL Apache :help, this is showing all of the Apache commands. There's also things like, MySQL. If I do MySQL help, we can see the different options here for MySQL. Okay. By the way, one of these, let's see, for MySQL, if I do, I think just help by itself, ASCTL all help, this will give you everything, right? So here's the things you can do with all. within all, here are the things that you can do, let's say with Faspex or Apache or MySQL. Going up here, if I do Faspex : help, this is the one I wanted to show, Faspex : backup database. Okay, so this is something that you can put, let's say in a cron tab, right? Do an automated backup every, however often makes sense for you. This file will be dumped out here. This includes a full MySQL dump. And so if you come back and pick this up with your regular backup scheme, you'd be able to restore everything automatically here. There is also a way, by the way, here under the server tab to do save and restore through the web interface. So if you're making some changes or something like that through the web interface, you don't have SSH readily handy, you can download and restore the config directly here. Okay, and then finally, this is all in the Aspera Faspex admin guide, so I won't go into it too much, but there is, again, everything's in Aspera. There is Aspera Faspex log that has a ton of log files. You typically won't need these day to day, but if you're working with Aspera support on a particular issue, they may ask you for the log files. You can see all of the individual processes that run under Faspex are kind of broken out here for troubleshooting purposes. Some of the underlying components, like Apache and MySQL, have their own logs. The typical Apache logs, for example, are in Aspera Apache logs, as you'd expect. These are the typical HTTPD logs. So some of these for the underlying components are spread out a bit. These are all, again, spelled out in the Faspex admin guide, but these are typically the ones you deal with most: Aspera Faspex log, and then common Apache logs or MySQL logs.